Good morning to those of you who are joining. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Welcome. I'm going to let a few more people log in before we get started. Awesome. Well, good morning, those of you who decided to join us for our webinar. We're excited to have you join us in this discussion around working from anywhere. And we have a wonderful panel joining us today in this discussion. And before we get started, I will cover some quick housekeeping items. First is, I have my chat window open and I will be moderating the chat. What I will ask of you is if you have questions for the panel, please use the Q&A button in your navigation bar. So we'll be monitoring and collecting questions, and we'll make sure that we save some time in this webinar to answer your questions. So as opposed to putting your questions in chat, please put them in the Q&A. I will leave the chat open, however, if you want to make comments or you have quick things to share. So let's get started with some introductions. Quick housekeeping items. This is a 1-hour webinar. You can use the Q&A button to enter questions. The slides and the recording will be available to all attendees, so those will be sent out at the end of the webinar within the next day. There's also opportunities to connect with Xenium and any of the other panelists, so we'll make sure to introduce them and get you their contact information should you wish to reach out to them for any reason. And we will cover some information, and periodically throughout the presentation, we'll have opportunities for the panelists to share. We've included in our presentation the questions that were submitted by folks who registered. And in addition to that, we're also saving some space at the end of the presentation for some questions that come up for you as we go through the webinar today. So quick introductions. My name is Suzi Weir. I'm with Xenium. If you are a client or a friend of Xenium, I'm sure we've been in contact at some point. I've been here for quite a long time. This is my 20th year at Xenium. So happy to see you or have you join us. If this is the first time you've attended a Xenium webinar or training event, we're so happy you decided to join us, and we hope to see you in future training events and webinars. We have 3 wonderful panelists. I'm going to introduce each of them before we dive in. I'm going to start with Allie Green. Allie is a co-author of a brand new book, which I'll let her do a little plug in a couple seconds here. But just some background on Allie. She is a remote work expert. She's an advocate, a speaker, and she was the former director of people operations for DuckDuckGo. So Allie is using her startup and her remote team leadership experience to now consult and share her knowledge through her book. So Allie, do you want to share just a little bit about your book, exciting news about your book?
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. So today is the official launch day of Remote Works book. So if any of you are Amazon fans, you can go on right now and download it to your Kindle or go ahead and get a paper copy ordered to you, or go into your local retailer or bookstore and request a copy. And what's really cool about how this book is designed is it's intentionally made for you to interact with your team remotely and take best practices, not just from my lived experiences, but the lived experiences of my co-author, Tam, at a leading remote company, Automatic, and 30 plus remote work experts. Hear their stories, tailor the best practices for you. And so one thing you'll hear me say throughout today's panel is it depends a lot, and a lot of it does depend on the company culture and the team norms you're trying to create. And the book has tons of reflection questions and activities for you to go through and do it as if you were attending a workshop live.
That's great. Thank you, Allie. And it's just coincidental that we scheduled this webinar for this date, and today is the official release of our book. So wonderful, wonderful news for you, and quite an accomplishment. So hopefully you all check that out. We also have Nicole Blevins. She actually has a couple of roles at Xenium. She's an HR business partner, but she's also our HR services training manager. So she helps train our HR business partners. She's a senior professional in human resources. She, has her business degree and a concentration in HR management and a master's in HR. And, Nicole is a big part of our workplace culture at Xenium. She's, developed relationships across all of our teams and is a resource for many. So we're happy to have her join us as well. And then lastly, we have Wendy Kleinfeld. She is actually a friend and a peer of my professional peer of mine. Wendy is a career transformation coach. She has her own consulting business. She believes that anyone can achieve a life of joy and purpose through meaningful work. Her specialty is helping others realize their talents and enabling their transformation to pursue a fulfilling career. And then also helping organizations build leaders to become better people developers. Wendy has a rich background of living in 4 different countries across 3 continents. She has helped organizations grow their people across industries, including government, energy, and IT. Wendy holds a master's in positive organizational psychology and evaluation and a certificate in leadership coaching. So welcome, Wendy. It's so nice to have you. So let's kick off our discussion with just really recognizing where we're at today. This work from home, remote work, is our new norm for many roles. Certainly administrative, sales, service type roles that don't require being in a production environment or in front of customers in person. Many of these jobs can and are being performed at home. And, all of us, understand that COVID thrust us into that. And through that process, we've discovered that it is possible to make these work from home arrangements work for many positions. There is still a challenge, however, for organizations in terms of how do we create this fair and equitable employment experience? How do we maintain a connected workplace culture and achieve organizational results when you have either all of your workforce or a mix of your workforce working remotely and communicating virtually? So in this discussion today, we will talk about some trends, and I'll specifically share some stats from the McKinsey & Company survey that was conducted last year. And we'll also share with you some guidelines for remote work, hear from our professionals here on the panel in terms of what they're seeing in organizations and what knowledge they might impart to you all to help you create better workplace policies and cultures in your organizations. And then I'm just going to do a quick other reminder and plug that if you have questions along the way, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A. So this McKinsey & Company survey was conducted last year, the second half of last year, and they surveyed over 25,000 US employees. And among the respondents who were given the opportunity to work remotely, so they asked, those who were given the opportunity to work remotely, they reported 87% of those employees took their employer up on that offer. So that's indicative of a desire to have that flexibility to work from home. And interestingly, here's a breakdown of how many days per week employees reported working from home. So you can see a decent amount of those respondents are working 3 or more days from home. So 35% say they work from home full time. Another 23% can work from home 1 to 4 days a week. And then really only about 13% of the employees who responded to the survey said they could work remotely at least some of the time, but opted not to do so. And reasons for choosing to work on-site versus at home included things like just personal preference, and then maybe not having an optimal workspace or environment at home. So I wanted to ask the panel some questions about what their experience is. So let's start with Allie. Any input on what you are seeing in organizations in terms of trends in remote work arrangements, just in the last 6 to 12 months?
So it's really also perfect timing that to be able to talk to this question. There was an amazing study that was just released also today called the Flex Report by a company called Scoop. And I've had the opportunity to work with them on getting an inside peek on the data before today and really starting to think about how it reflects what I've been seeing anecdotally from clients. And through their study, they interviewed 4,000 companies, and I think it totaled 1 million people, that 51% of US companies are offering some sort of flexibility at work. There's a desire, there's a need for employees to have more flexibility in their life and in their work. And what that drills down to and the nuances really builds off of this study that you just showed, Suzi, which is that when it gets down to the company levels, leaders are still trying to figure out what works for them. So of this 51% of companies that offer some sort of remote work option or flexibility for their employees, right now only 8% are fully remote by design. But the majority, 23%, is employees' choice. And so employees' choice could mean any of these things that you showed us. Some employees might take 5 days a week. Some employees might take 2 or 3. And I think this is really interesting because this is where the questions and the conversations come up of, if not every employee is doing the same thing, how should we make processes that can support them in their personal choice? How can we make sure that there's a sense of fairness, depending that some people want certain things and some people want different things, instead of just falling back to kind of an easy way out, such as just making compromises and then making them standard across the board, which are things that we saw with Spotify that got a lot of attention recently with their no meeting policy. And that's something that if it works for them, great, that's awesome. But what are all of the edge cases? Did they consider those in making a company-wide policy that impacts hundreds of people before putting a stamp down on something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And I wrote down the name of that report too, so we can maybe share that if there's information available based on those results. So what about you, Nicole, in terms of your consulting work with clients? Are you seeing any trends, increase, decrease, in fully remote or hybrid work? What's your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I would say I'm definitely seeing an increase with clients in hiring positions that are 100% 100% remote all across the country in different states, whereas before they were really only hiring locally here in Oregon or in the Pacific Northwest, especially for harder to fill positions where they're having a hard time finding that local talent. Employers are realizing there's a whole United States or even beyond that with a ton of talent that we could tap into. So I'm definitely seeing a rise in hiring those 100% remote workers statewide. And then also in organizations or clients where they remained primarily in office largely for this time, just an increase of flexibility for employees, requests coming up of, I'm going on this trip, can I work remotely in another location for this week while I'm spending time with my family or doing other things? And organizations I'm seeing are largely approving that, realizing that they can still do the work while allowing that flexibility in short bursts here and there. So definitely a lot of new things coming out of this new work that we're working in.
Great, thanks. Wendy, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Susie. So really great comments from both Nicole and Allie. And this question is always really interesting to me because I started my career out 100% remote. So I think my case is a little bit unique from other folks where I've, since day one of my, kind of corporate career, I've been in the remote space. And so anytime I would hear employers push against work from home or remote work, I was always puzzled because, again, I was born out of the world where all my colleagues were remote. In fact, at the time, we didn't really have video conferencing. So it was all, faceless over the phone. Definitely since the pandemic over the last few years, I've been more optimistic for everybody else because this is kind of the world I came from. I've always been a big proponent for it. And I'm definitely seeing more employers being very open to it. Employers that have been in industries that are more traditional and have been a little more hesitant are suddenly realizing if we want to compete in a talent market space, they have to reach beyond their zip codes. So I think there is definitely much more of a tolerance, even from industries and organizations that traditionally have been very guarded about where they get their talent. So there's definitely, I think, a bigger marketplace for a lot of employees and potential employees today, just because the doors have been open. Like you were saying, Nicole, it's not even just within the boundaries of the United States, right? Mm-hmm. So employees today can even look for work outside the United States and vice versa, employers looking for overseas employees. So there's definitely, I think, a much more flexible marketplace, and especially with talent being hard to fill, I think that definitely adds a critical influence to employers wanting to be more open and being more welcoming of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know you've worked in a number of industries, but you do have some experience working in technology industry. Yes. And we know digital and technology professions tend to fall in the higher percentage of remote roles, but a challenge for relationship focused businesses. So some industries that are highly, client facing, customer relationship focused, they're concerned about balancing both customer and employee needs. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested, Wendy, in your thoughts. Do you think hybrid is a good model for that type of industry, or could it work all remote?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to piggyback off what Allie said before, which is it really depends, right? You have to look at what's going to work for your culture and what's going to work for the employees. And I don't know whether folks on the panel would agree with me, but I think at the end of the day, remote work really is about flexibility, right? Why do we even offer remote work? Why is that an option? Well, it comes down to flexibility. People want remote work because it gives them more time to maybe wake up in the morning, have breakfast, spend little time with their family, or just cut out commute time so they can spend more time doing the things that they value in their personal space. Whatever it is, it's about flexibility, I think. So if we're looking at organizations or businesses that need to have that more high touch face-to-face in order to operate, then I would say that maybe takes priority in terms of where employees work. But then think about, how do you offer employees flexibility in different ways? So if remote work is not always possible, could they have would remote work be possible on days maybe they're sick and they have to take care, or they have to take care of a sick child? Is that a possibility for them? Or is there another way they can get the flexibility they need without, if remote work is not possible, right? Because I understand there are different industries where you have to be much more on the ground, whether with customers or with your team members. So I think it's really looking at what are the individual needs and also the team needs, and not forgetting that whatever the business operation dictate, you have to kind of consider that too.
Mhm. Yeah. And any of the other panelists have anything to add in terms of that relationship management piece, balancing that?
I would just say is like a quick personal antidote. I think a lot of people have become more comfortable with letting people into their personal lives through a computer screen over the past couple of years, whether they were doing it to keep connected with family or friends in other locations than they were, or to continue business as normal. What I have found in the remote work community of people that are consultants, experts, and advocates in this space is that I have been able to develop closer relationships with people I've never met in person than when I was working in an office and just was coincidentally bumping into somebody who happened to work for the same company in the bathroom or at the coffee machine. There's a nostalgia for a water cooler, but when I actually had a water cooler, nobody cared about it. Nobody gathered there and did their talking and really got to know each other. I think what's going to shift culturally the mindset of remote work and relationship building is a willingness to be more vulnerable, to be more authentic, and to really reach out and have human person-to-person connections via work, and not try to uphold this kind of stiff professionalism that's been something that I've seen in generations prior to this one.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in my experience, I've realized you just need to be more intentional, right? You need, if you value relationship building and that's important for your business, then it's being intentional about how you're doing that, whether it's remote or in person, or organizing your work, right, to fit your work arrangements. So for example, it's nice for any folks in any industry to be able to have some flexibility, as Wendy mentioned. So, if I'm just doing computer work or administrative work, it doesn't really necessitate that I drive to an office to sit there to do that. But if I'm doing relationship building, that is the purpose of what I'm doing. So I'm meeting a new client, or I'm doing account management and checking in with a client, for example, then finding ways to do that in person if possible, or at least video face-to-face. I know we hate being on Zoom calls too much, but I think organizing how you're doing your work based on the activity can be helpful too. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the impact to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because this is an important topic. And in this research that McKinsey did, they did find that people in the US, which was their sample, who are younger, more educated, or have higher incomes tend to have more options to work remotely. When people of all types of backgrounds and abilities and races and genders value having that flexibility. So there is a disproportionate impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, as well as on performance if we're not paying attention to this. And even hybrid work can have the potential to create an unequal playing field or amplify the in-group versus out-group dynamics. So, hybrid has become, I think, a nice happy medium, but the challenge is if you have some people who are working in the office some of the time, and then some folks who are fully remote, are they getting the same exposure, access to resources, benefits, opportunities to build relationships, have their efforts recognized, all of those things. So I think this is definitely an important thing to consider as you're looking at your workplace culture and the type of work arrangements that you're offering. And clearly there's an impact on retention. You know, of those folks that they surveyed who prefer hybrid work, 71% of them say they're likely to look for other opportunities if that flexibility was not available. So if they said, okay, everybody needs to come back into the office. We've decided that this is the best thing for our culture. The employer's now mandating that everybody come back into the office, a majority or for the full week. That clearly, based on this survey, would have an impact on retention. And there are some interesting statistics around different groups of employees, and ultimately across the board, regardless of the employee's demographic, it is a retention risk if employees do in fact value that hybrid or remote work opportunity. And then regardless of these demographics, remote employees did say that they're looking for three things primarily. They're looking for work-life support. So their employer demonstrating appreciation for their non-work demands, responsibilities, and interests. They're looking for team building. So just because they're working remote doesn't mean that they don't see the value and want to connect and collaborate and develop relationships with team members. They want to foster trust, collaboration, and need to be able to have healthy conflict among team members. And then obviously foundational, everybody wants mutual respect. So their employer demonstrating concern for the well-being of their employees and requiring everybody to treat one another fairly and respectfully. So as it relates to this topic, I'm interested in the panel's experience. So we did talk about recruiting nationally or even internationally. That's really opened up that pool of talent, especially diverse talent for organizations. And so, I know for Xenium, we've probably cut our time to hire metric in half because we've looked outside of our local market and we've hired fully remote employees from other states. But the challenge with that is, how are you being intentional about providing those folks with equal opportunities and also including them in your workplace culture? So I'd love to hear from, maybe we'll start with Wendy. What are some maybe guidelines or tips that you might have for employers who are looking to improve equity or inclusion when they have employees who are working both in the office and remote?
Yeah, and this is a tough one, right? So I think I've been hearing this question, I think, all throughout last year, because as to your previous question, are we seeing more of a trend of remote work? Well, yes, we are. And also on the flip side, I think employers are also struggling of how to create a culture that's uniformly experienced. And so I think there has to first be a lot of intentionality in looking at where there may be gaps in equity and inclusion. If it's around performance, then maybe that's an opportunity to look at how the current performance system or the processes may lend itself to more bias or can be more inclusive. Something that I think is not process focused, but is often overlooked, is the kind of nuanced relationship building that happens in the office, right? I've been in companies where I've been actually in a lot of companies where there's been a hybrid model or a combination of in-office and out of remote employees. And one of the things I've noticed that is especially when all the major leaders or the top leaders are on location and you have some employees who are there, they're naturally and organically There's some relationship building, and there's some also kind of out of office activities that can happen, happy hours, let's go grab a quick lunch, coffees and all that. And those are great. However, oftentimes we don't realize, but all those times that we spend with other people over lunch, over food and coffee actually really builds up more and more rapport, right? Which is why we tend to take people out to lunch or go spend time with them in different format, in different ways, because we know it builds more trust, it strengthens the relationship. However, people who are not working in the office will miss out on that. So then leaders have to intentionally think about, is this something that they need to cut back on? And this is not to say that they have to tell their employees, hey, we cannot go out or we cannot do any office celebrations, but it's being mindful of, are they consistently only going out with certain folks on the team, and then the remote employees hear about it, and then they might feel, kind of in their head, like, we're kind of missing out, but what can I do? I think part of it is also looking at how you build relationships in office. Sometimes it's unintentional and it happens organically, but I think that's where leaders can kind of step in and think about, how do they informally build those relationships in office? And if they want to continue on this kind of more casual culture, which I think is great for especially the younger generation, then they have to consider, how do they try to give opportunities to people who are working remotely? So I think there's definitely the relationship piece where there may be that imbalance, because people will see relationship as the key to promotion, as the key to getting the better project. So I think that's an area where leaders can really focus on. And I think consistently getting feedback from employees, looking at where they're feeling like they may be missing out on. Some employees who thrive on remote work might say, you know what, I'm doing great. I've got a great manager. I like my coworkers. I'm doing fine. Right. And then there may be some who do yearn for more of that face time. So how do you include them in a little bit more? So I think there has to be also an individual consideration. So managers do need to tune in a little bit more, rather than just giving a blanket approach of how they want to manage the rapport that they have with their different team members. So I'll just kind of stop there and just really summing it up as, there's areas and processes you can look at. But I think more often than not, you do need to look at the relationship piece, because it is so unspoken oftentimes, and there's not really often any policy, and it just forms organically. So pay attention to definitely how you build relationships and how you build that relationship over kind of the digital borders.
Yeah. And I think of just the remote folks having access to information, accessible knowledge, tools, people to do their job. And back when you were talking about the relationship building in these informal lunches or coffee meetings or happy hours, if there's work being discussed in those informal gatherings, that and those employees are benefiting from that knowledge, or having exposure to information about the company or the organization, then that can create some potential inequities too to the employees who don't have that visibility.
I'll just quickly add to that, what I don't often see, but I have seen some managers do, and it's a game changer, is figuring out what is a decision-making model for their team. And one of the things that I've seen being a really impactful in a positive way is the team deciding that whatever decisions or discussions are happening on the team, it needs to happen with everyone present. So we don't have we have a team meeting, we decide on something and everyone logs off, but the person who happens to be there with the boss says, hey, you know what? I just have this quick idea I forgot to bring up during the meeting. What about this? And all of a sudden now things have shifted and there's influence from another team member on the decision, and everyone else is going, wait, I thought we just decided in a meeting. What changed? So it's these little nuanced instances where I think managers and leaders do need to pay attention to. So having that kind of system of how do we make decisions? How do we stick to decisions? How do we work as a team? I think can be really, really helpful, even though it sounds like it's just another thing to do. But I think if we want to plan for the long term, I think it'll be beneficial to spend a little time in thinking about that.
Yeah.
I'd love to piggyback off this just for 1 second, because I'm hearing Wendy talk about all of these like nuanced situations that could happen one-off, and a lot about relationships in the office. Suzi, I'm hearing you say some things too about documentation and making sure all these things live online. And when I take a bigger step back from what everyone's saying, the way that I like to talk about these things are what are the standard operating behaviors of our company. And I think it's imperative in the future that even if you're going to be in office 5 times a day, even if you're going to be a hybrid model, that you operate your company as if it's remote first, which means that you have the building blocks of a remote company. There's clear documentation and a knowledge base that everyone has access to on the standard operating behavior. The cultural value to back that up is that if there's a situation where after the meeting, somebody's turning to the boss and saying, hey, I have this idea, that it's the expectation of the manager, and this is a standard operating behavior that's upheld, that manager shuts it down, that says, hey, the meeting ended, go to the knowledge base and add your ideas there, because it is those little micro moments that is going to create the informal culture of the company. And the informal culture should match the very clear expectations that are equitable for everybody, regardless of if you're spending more time or less time in an office. And so I think the more that you can put things against the process, like having a clear rubric for professional development, making sure that you're thinking about, okay, yes, maybe there's informal lunches going on, but what are the standard operating behaviors and how do we onboard people to really know those values and to live those values? Do they have good examples to look up to in the organization, or do they have bad examples to look up to in the organization? And how are we educating and providing training to those bad examples, let's say, and making sure that those behaviors are really back to being intentional, which is super hard to do. It's a muscle that people have to work out. And so I think that leadership and people ops needs to give a ton of support to managers as they make these behavioral transitions.
Yeah, that's great. Great point. On like operationalizing, right? The way that you make decisions, the way that you're communicating, the way that you're meeting, and base that off a remote workplace, so that you can make sure that you're not going to miss those opportunities. So I think it's the process, but then also there are some skills and behaviors that leaders and employees can probably benefit from receiving some training. Nicole, what about your experience and your ideas for team building or company events that can include out of area employees?
Yeah, I've actually seen some really cool and creative things that clients have done, and I've had the opportunity to be a part of one in particular where, and I know there's the whole conversation of Zoom fatigue and people not wanting to be on long remote meetings, but I've seen a really cool 100% remote type of conference that an organization put on where they had like a comedian virtually do a set and just do some different like wine and chocolate tastings to get everyone involved no matter where they are, and allowing breakout rooms and opportunities for employees that don't get to connect regularly connect. And I was part of that, and I personally thought it was really cool. And they even invited like families to join, right? Because that's a long time to potentially be away from your family. So allowing your family members or people in your home also being a part of that connection, I think can go a long way. So you're not taking people away from their families or from doing things that they want to do outside of work, but really involving them in the conversation and building a stronger relationship. And then also, if you're having local events, potentially flying in people that might be dispersed in other places to really get that type of interaction is a great option as well. And lastly, I would just say technology is an amazing resource, as we've talked about. So there's just tons of technology available, Teams, Slack channels, and ways for people to just stay connected and have conversation starters to get conversations going between employees as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what Ali said about be thinking like a remote employer.
Yeah.
So that when you're scheduling these types of events or activities, you're doing it with the remote employees in mind.
Yeah.
And not everything, it may be that they can't attend everything, but what are you doing to make sure that they feel included? So I think that goes back to also just the day-to-day work and the need for employees to collaborate. And so really carving out those opportunities for team members to connect and collaborate, and then allowing them the time to actually do their heads down work in their environment that they choose, right? So if you can get people to come together on a regular, or maybe even a few times a year, to connect with their team members in person, that would be great. But not, making it a requirement for people to drive into the office and just sit at their desk waiting to collaborate with people when they could be more efficient at home. So that kind of segues to the next question, or the next topic, around scheduling in office time, especially for the hybrid folks. So do we schedule everybody the same days so that everybody's in the office at the same time? That way we can make sure that we're, folks are connecting in person. Or do we mandate specific number of days a week? So employers, I think, are still trying to figure out, is there a good recipe for this? Do we just let people based on their role decide what works for them? Is that providing enough structure and consistency? So I think between scheduling and then also designing the office space, a lot of employers are looking at, okay, a deterrent for employees coming back into the office is if they have to sit in a cube and do their heads down work, that is much less productive for them and distracting than if they were at home, for example. So there's some workplace redesign that I hear is happening a lot in organizations, to create spaces based on the type of work that's performed, in addition to allowing people to do more of that heads down focused work at home, and then setting aside time in the office for more of the collaborative types of activities. So let's start with Allie on this one. Have you seen effective scheduling arrangements? Or for example, like, has there been a hybrid type scheduling arrangement that you've seen that's effective, and why?
So there's two things I think to go into here. There's definitely a schema that's becoming the most popular and the most common. To call any of the schemas effective, I think, is not going back to the main lesson of intentionality. Why, for this specific company or this specific team, are there reasons to come together in person where the ROI is more valuable to do unique things together that can't be done in a virtual setting? And I think until each team lead sits down with their team, or each company sits down and asks their leadership team via surveys, diary studies with employees at all levels of the organization, that why question won't be answered. And you can't measure effectiveness until you know what is the purpose of bringing people together in the office. So you say things like, okay, it's for connection. Great. What type of connection do you want? Is connection just, you want to create spontaneity and opportunities for people to talk? What do you want them to talk about? Do you want them to use this time for brainstorming? Well, if so, then how are you redesigning the office to be more creative so that there's areas to play and use your hands and draw things out? And how are you teaching people brainstorming skills so that when they come into the office, they know they have a meeting for brainstorming? What does the asynchronous pre-work look like for that type of activity? And so it all goes back down to designing every aspect of the work itself and the employee engagement before you think through why should people come into the office. I will say that through the research that I've seen, both with the Flex report and also just talking to all of my friends that are in hybrid companies here in the United States, that Tuesdays seem to be the most popular day people are going into the office. But what's really interesting about that is we interviewed someone for our book named Mike that managed a group of people in a really high density urban city where a lot of people were commuting into the city for work. And he found on his team, despite all of this other research, that the most popular day was Fridays. And it was not for any reason for the company at all. It was basically because if people were going to commute into the city and they did it on a Friday, then they could go out after work and make like a whole event and to do out of being in this particular location. And so I also think where your office is located and where your employees are located can shift the reason why people would or would not want to come into the office.
Yeah. So to your point, there's not one size that fits all. Every
No.
workplace, every, organization or even individual employees. So taking the time to have conversations with your employees, whether it's informal feedback, surveying, to understand what their needs and values are and evaluate options from there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a really cool tool that we share, the team charter exercise. And I think this can be really beneficial for managers that don't know how to have these conversations, to just figure out like, what are our team goals? What do we as a team want? And from there, going through a series of very directed questions, you can notice that there might be thematic trends of everyone does want to come into the office on Tuesday, and they really want to not use that time for heads down focus time. So it doesn't matter if they have productive areas in the company, but they want to use that time to reconnect with each other. And so planning, intentional conversations, maybe something like a lunch roulette where they're getting paired up with different people they don't normally work with and they don't normally have virtual meetings with, could be a really innovative way of designing a workplace experience where people want to come in. They've said they wanted to come in, and then what they do when they get there is very special and unique.
Yeah.
I would love to add something, Susie, if I can.
Yeah.
So I think an interesting influence here, and it's something that I've had to really change my mind on, is that not all of the younger generation or the younger professionals want remote work all the time. So one of the things I've been hearing, and especially in our company or the companies that I've worked with, is when they're global and you have offices in different countries where the cultural expectations and work expectations are different. And then you confound that with younger generation of newly grads who, over the pandemic have not worked in an office environment. And maybe this job is their first corporate job, or maybe their second, big girl, big boy job. And they still don't even know what it's like to be a professional. So they're really yearning to model behavior. They are thirsty to learn more. And oftentimes they actually might resent working from home because they most likely have had to finish their degree at home, locked at home. And now their entry into the workforce is in the same chair, in the same pajamas, and they want to feel grown up. They want to feel like they've reached another milestone in life. So I think there's a percentage of the younger generation that I think employers need to pay special attention on, not just with the existing workforce, but also how do we prep the younger generation of professionals to succeed when we know that they've maybe missed out just due to the influences of the pandemic and how it's affected their environment. So I think that's a really interesting force that's kind of happening too, because I know you talked about the statistic earlier around how younger folks tend to get more opportunities to do remote work, and I think that's true. I think it's a yes, and many of them want to have the mentoring, want to have that coaching, and they want to see older professionals for more experience and kind of want to, see how they behave, how do they talk, and how do they interact, so that they know what to look up to and what their expectations are.
Yes, absolutely. It reminds me of the latchkey employee discussion that I had on one of our recent podcasts. And there is a need and desire for mentorship for these younger employees too. And not that you can't get it through remote means or relationship building, but a lot of them have communicated or seeking that in-person exposure and connection. So I think it goes back to Allie's point is, and your point too, Nicole, or Wendy, be careful not to make assumptions what people want. You know, it's an ongoing conversation. And I love the idea of the team charter. That's a great tool just for teams anyways, to get really aligned on what's our purpose as our team. How can we clearly define the roles and responsibilities, and including how we're going to perform that work and reach our goals, and in what type of environment works best for all of us. So thanks for sharing that. I want to just touch on, because I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions here too, but there is this other piece, the regulatory and administrative requirements of employers that obviously need to be considered. Xenium is an HR company, so this is something that we manage for our clients, and so and we're very well aware of it for ourselves as an employer. But I think making sure that you have a policy in place, number one, regarding telecommuting, and if existing employees are looking to relocate, requiring or asking for some heads up or communication. I know something that happened during the pandemic was employees would picking up and moving, relocating to other states, and then telling their employers after the fact. Employers were like, oh, now I need to get registered as an employer in that state, set up a tax account, make sure you can access your benefits, you have workers' compensation coverage, all of these things. And the employees, of course, they don't understand what's all required. So having some policy and communication in place for employees, so they know, okay, here's what is an option and what might not be. So here, obviously, on this slide is a list of all the things, and there's probably more than this that employers need to worry about. But if you're going to be hiring people who live and work in different states, there's business licensing that needs to be set up, state employment and tax accounts, compensation. There's, different strategies. Do you base your compensation on your market where you are based, or do you have a geographical strategy where you base it on the location of the employee? That can impact your ability to compete for talent. Do you have access for all of your employees to benefits? Do you need a national plan, or are there networks that employees can access who live in these various states? Policies pertaining to leave laws and different employee protections depending upon the states they live. And then cybersecurity is another thing. So employees who are using remote networks and equipment, are they trained on how to, utilize their equipment and the company networks in a safe and secure way? So Nicole, I'm going to throw this out to you.
Yeah.
How are people ops teams or HR folks, how are they automating, simplifying operations and their compliance processes when an employee moves to a new jurisdiction or they decide to hire someone in a new state?
Yeah, this is a great point, and I'm glad that there's a slide dedicated to this and we're talking about this because there were also a few questions in the chat pertaining a little bit to the challenges associated with, having to get set up in a new state. So it's definitely challenging. Every state has their own employment law, tax requirements, a multitude of things. So and you as a business owner or manager or employer can't be an expert in all of those different areas, right? And try to manage that for all different states and the tax implications and policies and compensation. So really, it's really a mixture of just leveraging your partners and your resources, like your payroll provider, your workers' compensation broker, and getting a effective and repeatable process in place when you're hiring remotely or dealing with employees in multiple states that are dispersed all over the place. For new hires, you want to create as seamless experience as possible because you're onboarding them to your organization, right? So really evaluating a new hire checklist, putting something in place to make sure that you've got methods to where you're getting all of those steps done and set up in advance, the compliance posters, all of that fun stuff. But I think it just really goes back to every state is so different. Employment laws, business tax registration is complicated. So the easiest way to simplify is just leaning on your resources and partners and finding people that are experts in those areas to surround yourself with and be able to support you through that process to make sure that your organization is effective and hitting all of those touch points. And like you mentioned, Suzi, Xenium, obviously we do a lot of this for our clients. So we're a great resource. I see in the participant list, some of my clients or people that I work with are on this call. So we help a lot of businesses with that and are happy to be a resource to others that need that kind of support as well.
Yeah, I think, there are multiple pieces here. So if you can streamline your resources, which this is a shameless plug for Xenium, but we have the compliance expertise and we do the administrative work as well.
The payroll.
So between that and brokers, to be able to outsource some of that is a huge help. Otherwise, you're having to hire and develop that expertise internally, which, probably doesn't end up being as cost effective. So I love your point about the checklist. So creating a process and checklist for, operating in new states. So the new state setup process and checklist would be definitely helpful, and getting all of your department leaders in that conversation so everybody knows what's required before they start making some of these decisions or communicating with their employees. So one question that came up, and I'm interested in any of your input. So what tips might you have for balancing staff wellness and accountability? So this question comes up quite a bit because, as leaders, employers, we have good intent, but we also need to produce results, right? We need to hold our employees accountable. So any, advice you might give, maybe Allie, on helping leaders balance staff wellness and accountability?
For me, this goes back to some of the key principles that you shared earlier around what employees want. There's a sense of respect. I think you need to trust that your employees, when given the resources to do a good job and have clear end goals, will try to make that happen if they have it in their capabilities to do so. In terms of work-life support, having it be part of your standard operating behaviors that boundaries are okay. And in order to do that, you need to create very clear expectations across the way. And so how I would tactically operationalize something like that is, what is the business goal? How does my project goal that I, Allie, am responsible for lead up to that business goal? What are the outputs and outcomes that I'm going to be evaluated on? And this is such a sticking point. This is such a hard behavior for companies to change because they're used to seeing input and evaluating input and not necessarily being very clear on how they're evaluating and judging output. But if you can get there and say, these are the clear goals at a project level that you're responsible for, Allie. And in addition, there's expectations on how you show your work. And so asynchronously through our project management tool, we expect you to do X, Y, and Z behaviors or activities to keep everybody in the loop in terms of building relationships with stakeholders. If all of those things can be done, then we also trust you, Allie, as the employee, to figure out when it is in your best interest in terms of wellness, of when you're getting that work done, where you're getting that work done, and how you're getting that work done, as long as the conversation stays a two-way street and that there's transparency in the work itself. And so I think really allowing and enabling employees to have that ownership over setting those boundaries is instrumental, because before, when I first started my career, I didn't have the power to do that. I was told you have to be in the office from 8 to 5 and you need to be working. And not only were those some of the worst hours for me from a productivity and energy management standpoint, but I wasn't creative in that space. And I didn't feel necessarily like physically comfortable, like in my, business dress, getting commuting on a subway every hour, to get there every day. And so really taking a step back and saying, this is what we expect of you. And we also trust you enough to do that in a way that serves you. And now I can get some of my best work done on a sofa at an Airbnb or at a cafe overlooking the beach. And it doesn't mean that I'm any less devoted to my work. In fact, it means that I'm more motivated to the mission of the project that I've been tasked with.
Yeah.
Great. Can I ask one question that came through, since we only have a couple minutes left, and if there are questions that we didn't get answered, I'll make sure to follow up when we circle back with the slides and the recording link. Any, well, let me ask it this way to any of you. Any advice for HR folks, leaders who are hoping to sell the benefits of working remotely in an organization that's not necessarily open to that?
I'll just have a quick one to add, and I'd love to hear what Nicole and Allie have to say about this, because sometimes I can be, I'm very quick to come up with some of these. So my first impression when, again, this is not just a question, I'm sure, from the group, but we hear this a lot in the news, right? A lot of companies, especially in the Silicon Valley of all places, big companies have required return to work. One of the first things I think to myself when I see these news pieces, and what I would love to be able to ask these leaders is, what goals or what financial targets have you not met over the last few years during the pandemic that you can attribute to that people weren't on site? And I would say a lot of those companies that are requiring a return to work right now are the companies that grew in revenue and size over the pandemic. So to the organizations out there, if it's you're in the board or you're in the kind of the top executive leadership level, or you're even in the frontline manager level, I would just challenge them and say, what is it that you're not seeing from work from home employees that you need to be able to see on site? And what benefit is it really bringing other than securing your own fear that your people aren't performing? Oftentimes I find that to be more of an individual leader insecurity rather than a performance issue. Now, at the same time, I'm also of the belief that you can't convince people if they truly are pushing against it. However, I think there's an opportunity to maybe dig deeper and see where that fear is coming from. Is it fear that they may be not building the culture that they want to see? So if culture is a problem, then let's try to solve for that. If it's a productivity or performance issue, well, let's take a look at that. Have we seen actually a downturn in productivity or performance? So kind of digging to the roots to find out what the problem is and what is it that we're really trying to solve here. I can't promise that the person might change their mind, because again, I think sometimes individual leaders come into a situation with their own biases and fears. But if you can kind of dig deeper and look to kind of what's driving some of this and what problems you can try help organizations solve, I think that can at least bring you a few steps closer to figuring out what it is that they're trying to mitigate or trying to resolve by bringing people back to work.
Yeah, and we're at time, so I appreciate your input. I wish we can go on even longer, and I am capturing, there were a couple of questions that didn't get answered. They actually were related to this accountability piece. I think there's been this worry about the quiet quitting, which is, a real thing, holding employees accountable to fairly and equally accountable to performance results. And so I think I'm just going to say one more thing based on what you said, Wendy. And in my experience, it's looking at how are you communicating around performance? How are you setting shared expectations, and how are you communicating about performance? And are you having those regular, consistent one-on-one meetings and have clear measures for success? And that really applies whether someone's in person and you can physically observe them working at their desk, or if they're working at home. So really having that process in place where you're having those regular scheduled conversations about performance and you're clarifying expectations and there's clear measurable results, that kind of cuts down on some of that subjectivity as it relates to performance management. And also, we don't need to micromanage either in that sense. So I will follow up with some responses to, I think there were just a couple questions we didn't get to. So I will make sure to note those and follow up. And just want to let people know that we have additional resources available on our website that are free, blog posts. We have a great podcast that Brandon Laws leads, and there's some great guests and topics on that. And then also you can keep in touch with us for future events. We will send out, as I said earlier, a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And feel free to check out Allie's book. I'll send you that information as well. I want to say thank you to our panelists. Maybe we'll schedule a part 2 discussion on this later this year to see how things are going. And I hope everybody who attended has a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, Susie.
Sure.
Thanks all for who joined.
Thank you.